Professor Tim McCormack is an expert on international humanitarian law. He's Dean of the Law School at University of Tasmania and a Professorial Fellow at the Melbourne Law School. He's also the Special Advisor to the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court in The Hague and a Director of World Vision Australia. He was the Expert Advisor on Law of War to the Defence Team for Australian David Hicks when he went before the US Military Commission in Guantanamo Bay, and he was also designated amicus curiae, friend of the court, in the trial of Slobodan Milosevic. He's been in the country all of this past week as the New Zealand Law Foundation's Distinguished Visiting Fellow, giving a number of talks, including one on the use of chemical weapons in Syria. I started off by asking him how international humanitarian law applies once a war is going on.
Independently of the question who's right and who's wrong in terms of the resort to violence in the first place, international humanitarian law applies to all the parties to the conflict, and there are really two key categories of rules under international humanitarian law applicable in a war or an armed conflict. We talk about armed conflict as a more general, all-encompassing term because war, at least as a legal term, requires a formal declaration of war, whereas armed conflict, say the law applies even if there's been no formal declaration of war once the factual requirements of the existence of an armed conflict occurs. So two key categories of rules. One is protection of different categories of victims of armed conflict, so whether it's wounded and sick combatants on land, wounded, sick and shipwrecked combatants at sea, prisoners of war or civilians, all of them are subject to special legal protections, how they can be treated and not mistreated and abused. And then the second category of rules we'd call the regulation of the means and methods of warfare, prohibited weapons, a law on targeting, what is a legitimate military objective, prohibition on deliberate targeting of civilians, limitations on directing lethal firepower against a legitimate military objective where civilians may be incidentally killed or damaged to civilian property, proportionality, that sort of stuff.
And both of those aspects, I want to talk to you about them in relation to what's happening in Syria, because in terms of both of those that you've just outlined, they've both been contravened when it comes to the conflict in Syria, haven't they?
On a daily basis, which is one of the great tragedies of this humanitarian catastrophe that Syria is experiencing.
And you've been looking at why, amidst all of these egregious acts, barrel bombs, shelling of hospitals, why chemical weapons in particular have elicited such a strong response, a disproportionately strong perhaps response, where other acts of illegality have not. Yeah,
look, I'd say the starting point for me, Noelle, is profound sadness for the people of Syria. Whatever academic interests I have in questions like that, I want to try to always remember the humanity here, because you look at the statistics, by any measure this is a shocking series of conflicts that has completely disrupted the country. 3% of the population killed from fighting, nearly 80% of the population displaced either internally in Syria or as refugees across the border. Way over 80% of the country dependent on humanitarian assistance just for the basic necessities of life. So this is a devastation for the country of Syria. Whenever I start to think about international law and its intended or purported ameliorating effect on human devastation, Syria exposes the limitations to the discipline that I've committed myself to for so long. So I feel deeply sad about that, and I think that's the right place to start rather than launching into what might be intellectually interesting and intriguing but overlooks or bypasses the devastation of what's happened there.
The catastrophe. I should say at this point, I think one of the most heartrending interviews that was ever broadcast on this radio station was in 2015 when Susie Ferguson, the host of our breakfast show, Morning Report, our news show, broadcast an interview with a doctor at a hospital in Syria, and nobody who heard what that man said and how he said it and how he spoke about the scale and the catastrophe, the humanitarian catastrophe that was unfolding there, could fail to have been moved by that.
Yeah. Well, I'm not surprised by that, and I read about people inside Syria, whether they're first responders, whether they're health professionals, desperately trying to do the best that they can to alleviate some of the suffering. They repeatedly say they are shocked, that we in the West are shocked at certain images that come out of the conflict. And how can you not, from their perspective, how can we not be dismayed on a daily basis? And I guess I'm very conscious of the fact that it's easy to become inured by the suffering because of the scale, because of the protracted nature of the conflict, because of the relentless, egregious violations of what we consider to be basic laws about how warfare should be conducted.
And this is something you're acknowledging, because there's a triage of sorts going on here in thinking about chemical weapons.
Yeah, that's right. There certainly is, and I'm still intrigued by the disparity of responses to atrocities, but not in I don't want to discuss that in isolation of acknowledging this devastation that's been wreaked upon the country. That was once a great society, and now you wonder whether it can ever possibly rebuild in its previous form.
Our repugnance and horror that we feel towards chemical weapons, that has historic as well as psychological dimensions, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think it does. Yeah, and I guess I would say that it's easy to sort of try to grasp hold of the historical aspects to explain the repugnance, but I'm reticent to do that because I think that other atrocities also have a long history of prohibition, and yet for whatever reason they don't elicit the same response. So the historical stuff, I don't think it's an adequate explanation. And
given, of course, that they were in widespread use during World War I, for example.
Yeah, well, World War I, of course, was the most extensive use of particularly phosgene and mustard gas on the Western Front. 1.3 million casualties, 300,000 fatalities, and an additional 1 million wounded as a consequence of ingestion of gas on the Western Front. That's humans. I mean, that doesn't account the cost to horses or other animals that were used in the war, also exposed to the mustard gas and phosgene. But of those 1 million additional wounded in the statistics, many of them, of course, died prematurely from bronchial and esophagus-related lungs and esophagus-related injury.
The psychological aspect, the designation of chemical weapons as dreaded risk, that puts them in a particular category, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's certainly an argument that this is a particular category of what the psychologists and sociologists of war would describe as a category of dreaded risk. And I understand that argument, and I think there must be something to that as part of the explanation for the more substantive reaction. But I guess I'm still not prepared to concede that that's the sole explanation for why the rest of the international community would react more strongly to not just to initial use but recurrent use of chemical weapons. I think that people perhaps do have a more visceral reaction to images of victims of chemical weapons attack. I think particularly not only of the historic images from World War I, masks and bandages over faces and of thousands and thousands of victims, but I think of the images from the northern Iraqi Kurdish village of Halabja in 1988, where 5,000 people died from Saddam Hussein's military's use of sarin, the nerve gas, nerve agent, also used in Ghouta in the suburb of Damascus and several times since in Syria. But there we saw twisted bodies, some of them being sort of thrown onto the back of trucks in the positions that they were, the contorted positions bodies were found in when the relief effort sort of finally arrived in Halabja. They were pretty gruesome images that stay in your mind.
The absolute horror of that sort of death and those injuries, yeah.
Yeah, but we think about the use of imagery to shock and to evoke visceral reactions. We've seen plenty of examples of that in the Syrian conflict that involve what I would describe as more conventional weaponry, and still those images have not evoked the same level of outrage. So
there was one photo of a child in an ambulance covered in
ash
and incredibly distressed, which seemed to, for a time, galvanise people.
It did. It had a really fascinating reaction, didn't it? And that's one of the images, glad that you raised that specific one, that's one of the images that led a number of, I read a number of Syrian health professionals' reactions. We're shocked that you're shocked, that it takes an image like this for you to be shocked in the West about what's going on here, because this for us is something we are seeing tragically on a daily basis, multiple times a day. So, but you're right. I mean, that little helpless child sitting in the back of the ambulance, obviously just hauled out of rubble as a consequence of an airstrike on the home that he was living in, was one example of a sort of really an image that captured imagination, that evoked a particularly strong response temporarily.
The power of images like that is they suggest all of the other children and all of the other moments that we do not see.
Yeah. And I mean, I don't know if you remember, Noel, but after President Trump's first attack with Tomahawk cruise missiles on the airbase in Syria in 2017, he talked about how none of God's children should be subject to weapons like this.
Beautiful babies. Beautiful babies,
yeah. And there's all sorts of ways you can respond to that. But we've seen plenty of images of children, the victims of conflicts in Syria, by conventional means that has not produced or evoked a 56 Tomahawk cruise missile barrage response.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned Trump and you mentioned those comments, because even critics of the president, of which there are many, were united in a consensus that these targeted strikes were the right thing to do, were an example of unilateral leadership by the United States of America, which I imagine ties into your research and your thesis. Why in particular did the threat of and intelligence around chemical weapons lead to such support for this action?
Yeah. Perhaps on the first issue of the support for it, part of my cynicism about the motivations for the attack, for that particular strike, have to do with this is a way we can, the incoming administration can distance itself from the Obama administration. President Obama talked about his red line right back in 2012. He made that speech, or 2013?
2013 in August.
2013. Thanks for that
reminder. I've just been reading, it's funny, we're talking now, I've just been reading Ben Rhodes' book, which covers that whole area, and I want to ask you about
August
that.
2013, that's right. He was talking about what happens. One thing that would really disturb us in this conflict is if we saw chemical weapons being used. It was I would say well known. It was assumed with a high degree of certainty that Syria possessed a large stockpile of chemical weapons. They'd never been prepared to sign up to the Chemical Weapons Convention. So it was known in the West, well, not just in the West, around the world, that they were a major possessor state, exercising their sovereign right not to sign up to the Chemical Weapons Convention and forego that capability by declaring their production facilities, their stockpiles, and destroying them all. And he said in 2013, if we saw chemical weapons being used by the Assad regime, or he didn't say, or perhaps even worse, but the implication was there in the speech, or falling into the wrong hands, ISIS, for example, that would be a red line for me. That would change my calculus. That would change the balance of the equation, in my view. So, but then he didn't do anything about it when there was subsequent, and didn't do anything about it in terms of a forceful response.
Because he couldn't get, he said he chose not to do something about it because he couldn't get backing from his Congress.
Yeah.
He could have,
right.
but
that's
he
correct.
chose not to.
He chose not to, and I think that's a really important distinction. He chose not to do it, and President Trump, I think, saw an opportunity to do what Obama chose not to do. And it was a popular move.
This speaks to the question of intelligence, doesn't it, and the value or the quality of the information that you're given as an intelligence service or whoever is gathering the information. I know that in that particular instance, Jim Clapper was not convinced that it was, I think his line was, a slam dunk. And slam dunk had been the phrase they'd used previously in Iraq. So the context there, I suppose, is that the US had been bruised by previous actions.
Yeah, look, I think that the evidence was compelling that chemical weapons had been used. What was not, and in my view is still not clear, is who was responsible for them. And I think that's the issue that Jim Clapper was raising doubts about, and others have certainly voiced them. The Ghouta attack, it seems to me incredibly coincidental in timing, or else deliberately planned. Perhaps the latter's more readily explicable. You have this group of international inspectors that the UN Secretary General puts together because Bashar al-Assad, in response to a number of allegations in late 2013, early 2014, calls for an investigation. So if he's personally responsible, that's an interesting thing to do. The inspectors arrive in Damascus to get themselves ready to go out to the outer regional areas where the allegations of use happened in Aleppo and a couple of other towns, and then they've not been in situ in the country for more than 3 days, when less than 10 kilometres away from the hotel there is a massive 2,000 deaths, we now know, strike with surface-to-surface rockets of sarin gas. Now, we know, as a consequence of the investigation of the Ghouta attack, that the rockets were Syrian government military forces rockets. So from international law perspective, we'd say that makes the Syrian government responsible under the doctrine of state responsibility. If your military undertakes an attack, then the responsibility for the consequences of that are attributable to the government.
Which seems fair and just.
Which does seem fair and just, yeah. But from an international criminal law perspective, to actually tie Bashar al-Assad to that act or that conduct is not as straightforward, because unless he either ordered it or was complicit in it being carried out, we can't actually prove him responsible. And an alternative explanation, and I'm not suggesting either of these is correct, but an alternative explanation is that elements within his own armed forces, one possibility is that rogue elements within his own armed forces seized those weapons and carried out the attack to make it look like it was a Syrian government attack, to provoke a forceful response from the United States in the hope of helping to overthrow the regime of al-Assad.
Which has been al-Assad, and to a lesser extent Russia's line on these attacks consistently at the level, even all the way up to the level of the UN Security Council, has it not?
That's right, it has been, and I know that the prevailing orthodoxy certainly in the US and in other Western countries is to dismiss that line of argument, but I'm not sure that we could really put our hands on our hearts and say we've got incontrovertible proof that Bashar al-Assad's personally involved. And if that's the case, then let's be really careful about where we direct the responsive measures.
And all of this was playing into President Obama's decision-making, I imagine, back in 2013. What's fascinating reading the Rhodes book is how much thought and energy and care went into preparing the case for military strikes. You know, how important is that legal framework for targeted intervention, whether it's boots on the ground or a strike?
Yeah, I guess I'd distinguish the legal issues from the strategic military ones or the geopolitical ones. On the legal side, to justify that response, there has to be grounds for it, and the Obama administration, I'm sure, if they had undertaken forceful action, would have talked about either coming to the assistance of the Syrian civilian population, sort of a international responsibility to protect / humanitarian intervention type justification in the undertaking of a bombing campaign by US forces, which Australia and other countries joined, from Iraqi territory against ISIS targets in the east and southeast of Syria. The justification was self-defence of Iraq, coming to assist the self-defence of a sovereign nation, Iraq, because ISIS was using part of Syrian territory to launch cross-border attacks on Iraqi targets, and Syria, the government of Assad, had lost effective control and authority over the eastern part of the country and was unable to prevent its territory, sovereign territory, being used that way. So you have a lawful justification. There was always some obligation in addition that requires that the measures that are taken are proportionate to the basis of the justification in the first place.
And this comes back to that designation of chemical weapons as a particularly deadly and or repugnant threat to civilization and humanity.
Yeah, I think so. Yes, I think in both two strikes that Trump has authorised, he's been able to argue that they were, or his lawyers have been able to argue that they were strategic, they were limited, they were one-off, to send a message about the unacceptability of this. We'll keep on doing that every time there's a major chemical attack until the regime gets the message that this is completely unacceptable and unlawful. So, I mean, the proportionality thing is probably not difficult to demonstrate when the retaliatory measure is limited to a single strike. But I think from a political, international relations, geopolitical, military strategy point of view, neither President Obama nor President Trump ever wanted to initiate a war against the regime of Bashar al-Assad and pit themselves against the Russians. So,
well, the interesting thing in terms of what Trump did was the response or lack of response from Russia.
Exactly. And I find it fascinating that the one issue in the whole of the Syrian, well, I call it crisis, then I wonder if something that enters its 8th year can be called crisis, the catastrophe that is befallen Syria. One of the fascinating things about the response to the Ghouta attack, the establishment of a fact-finding mission by the UN, investigations of alleged use of chemical weapons, is that this is the first and arguably the only thing that Russia and the US have agreed about in relation to the Syria conflict. And I think that really, for me, that gets to the heart of what the motivation is for treating the chemical weapons violations differently than others.
What you see it as a way in which interests can coalesce.
These interests coalesce very effectively because both the US and Russia have foregone the right to develop and acquire and stockpile chemical weapons and use them, and neither of them want to see another country doing that, using a category of weapons that they've already decided to let go.
This speaks to an interesting question. You know, once a taboo, a global taboo, which we seem to have had on chemical weapons for a long time, since the total war of World War I. Once a taboo is broken, is it possible to reinstate it? Is it possible to put the genie back in the bottle in that regard?
Yeah, I've asked myself that question a few times. I found it fascinating back in the 80s that Iraq consistently violated the taboo against chemical weapons, a taboo that had been developed post-World War I as a reaction. 1925, Geneva Protocol prohibiting the use of chemical and bacteriological weapons in war. Iraq, throughout the 1980s in its war with Iran, violated that taboo on a regular basis against Iranian soldiers, and then in 1988 did this attack against the Kurdish villages in the north. And that was the catalyst for conclusion of multilateral negotiations on a comprehensive prohibition of chemical weapons. So the 1925 protocol was a prohibition on first use. A number of countries that signed up to the 1925 protocol said, we won't use chemical weapons, but we'll reserve the right to retaliate in kind if someone uses them against us. In 1993, so just 5 years after the Halabja attack, negotiations that had languished for nearly 20 years in Geneva finally were brought to a conclusion, and the Chemical Weapons Convention opened for signature, and that convention went way beyond anything prior to it in not only prohibiting the use but prohibiting possession, stockpiling, acquisition, transfer to another country, so export of and use of chemical weapons. And both the Russians and the Americans signed up to it. Now, we could say that before Syria had become a state party to that convention, before Syria had signed up the Chemical Weapons Convention, you could argue that the use of chemical weapons in the Syrian conflict could be a violation of the taboo at customary international law, but at least
they're acting as a sovereign state, and they have
outside the treaty regime.
Yes.
One of the fascinating things for me is that when the Russians and the Americans saw common interest in responding to the Ghouta chemical weapons attack, the first thing that they did was convince al-Assad that he needed to sign up to the Chemical Weapons Convention, declare his production facilities, declare his stockpiles, and commit to having all of them destroyed by international teams so they could be verified. The destruction could be verified. That all happened in a week after the Ghouta attack, which is extraordinary. And then we saw repeated violations of this taboo. And
you make the point in your report on this, I think you say, which raises the question, perhaps it would have been better had they never signed up rather than sign up and flout it.
That's a contentious argument, apparently.
Yes.
Some people have... No, I think it's worth asking a question.
But it is, isn't it? Because it undermines
the
entire institution. It undermines the convention.
Yeah, so just a few months after Syria became the newest state party to the Chemical Weapons Convention and one of the biggest non-state parties in terms of stockpiles to sign up. So I thought that was a breakthrough, hopefully.
A major player.
Yeah, a major player in terms of possession of chemical weapons, so with chemical weapons capability. Just within a few months of that, they became the first state party to be allegedly responsible for violations of the convention on their own physical territory. That's not a great endorsement of the bona fides of the participation in the treaty regime, unless, of course, we can say that it wasn't the regime itself; it was other players. But even so, this repeated violation of the convention on Syrian territory, I think, has an undermining effect on the strength of the normative prohibition in international law. And I do think that that's something that really agitates the organisation for the prohibition of chemical weapons, and probably the Americans and Russians as well.
But Tim, isn't the lack of meaningful consequences another undermining factor when you're talking about whether it's the convention about chemical weapons or whether it's various UN watchdogs? I mean, your report shows that it's only... that even now Syria isn't answerable to the International Criminal Court.
Yeah, I think that's one of my great laments for the whole situation. The lack of serious consequences does more than undermine the prohibitive norm against chemical weapons, but undermines international law as a legal framework. And I keep thinking to myself, Imagine going onto the streets of Aleppo or Homs or Hama or Dara or even suburbs of Damascus itself and asking people in the street, what do you know about international law and its constraining influence? And, I mean, of course the answer will be almost laughable, except the consequences are so tragic for Syria.
It's the last line of your report, isn't it?
It is.
For these benighted people, international law itself must seem illusory.
Yeah, illusory at best. And laughable, yeah, except the consequences are not humorous at all. So, I mean, the first thing I'd say about the norm against the use of chemical weapons is that it depends. I mean, the Chemical Weapons Convention states this explicitly. Where there is a violation of the convention, the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, headquartered in The Hague, has the first sort of response. They're the first responders. But in the end, to ensure that there are serious, substantive consequences, we rely on the UN Security Council's enforcement powers. Russia, as a permanent member, it will not allow the Security Council to punish the Assad regime, especially if it genuinely believes they might not even be responsible for the use of chemical weapons. But you're right. I mean, there's a much more general problem in relation to Syria about accountability, and I think on any measure, Syria should be subjected to the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. It's not, because it's not a state party and the Security Council won't refer it to the prosecutor.
Professor Tim McCormack is with us. We're talking about international humanitarian law. Given that failure of a multinational or a multilateral approach, Tim, how do you see, I mean, we talked about Donald Trump and contrasted his approach with that of Barack Obama. How do you see that far more unilateral stance that America is now taking on everything from trade to security?
Yeah, I guess as an international lawyer and not just a believer in multilateralism, but a promoter of it for all my academic career, we've lived for the last 30 years that I've been an academic interested in this subject matter, we've lived with US exceptionalism. I think I'd summarise that by saying, not defending the position, but saying that international law is for the rest of the international community because America, has the Bill of Rights and the Constitution, and we're fine, thanks very much. We've lived with that exceptionalism, but we're seeing it, taken to far deeper and broader levels than we've ever seen it before. And that, for me, is very disturbing because, I think from a country like Australia or the size of New Zealand, we're dependent upon an effective rules-based order internationally. Neither of us individually, and even both of us combined, when we can put aside sporting differences.
Don't mention the Bledisloe Cup, yeah?
No, what lamentable situation that is for my side of the table, Noel. But no, even together, we aren't big enough, powerful enough, influential enough to be able to achieve our foreign policy objectives on the basis of persuasion or force. So I think countries like ours depend upon an effective international world order, and if you believe in international peace and security and a collective approach to the implementation of that objective, then to see what Trump's doing individually and turning his back on so many multilateral organisations is profoundly disappointing.
And potentially an existential threat to the sorts of institutions
Possibly.
That you've spent a lot of time
Yeah, that's right.
working with and on. How much of a development is it that the chemical weapons watchdog can now determine blame? Because that's a new development in the last year, isn't it?
It is. It's a really interesting one the Russians oppose because they think it's a politically motivated...
Well, they're still saying those attacks were staged as a pretext for invasion, etc.
Yeah, that's right. And I guess if I was a Russian diplomat, I'd be saying those things too. I think it's a very significant development because I've been fascinated to sort of try to follow and piece together the timeline on multilateral responses to the allegations of chemical weapons attacks in Syria. And, the best we had for the first 3 or 4 years was a fact-finding mission. I'm not dismissive of the importance of finding the facts. I think that's actually really important because we want some independent verification of what actually happened, in what amounts and what consequences flowed and numbers of victims, and all those things are actually really important to document, to catalogue and to be clear about if there's ever to be some external or independent accountability mechanism. So I'm not dismissive of fact-finding as an objective in and of itself. But of course, in the absence of being able to say who we think's responsible, then it's limited in its efficacy. But maybe even with the authority to say who's responsible, we still might be limited in efficacy because we could have the sort of allegations on the table, but with no structures or procedures or mechanisms to be able to take the next step of actually issuing indictments and trying to prove cases against individuals allegedly responsible.
Because all of this, let's say, would happen at a time yet to be determined, but after the conflict's ended.
Yeah, that's for sure. I often reflect on my profession as an international humanitarian lawyer as a very reactive one, because when we're talking, as I do regularly in the International Criminal Court in The Hague, about holding individuals accountable, the damage has already been done. In fact, in my own personal life, the most important counterpoint to this constant reactive sort of approach to things is my work on the board of World Vision Australia, which I think is one of the organisations committed to trying to pull people out of poverty. It's much more proactive possibility of actually avoiding conflict in the first place.
Yes,
which more resources were poured into that.
I was interested in that when reading your biography. How do these two strands of your work, the hands-on humanitarian side of things and the much more perhaps abstract in some ways, even though the application of it isn't abstract, legal theorising, does that make you aware of the limits of the law?
Yeah, it does. And I'm always, I think it's important for me personally, and I hope some of my professional colleagues feel the same way. It's important to concede the limitations of what we're involved in, and to remind ourselves that that these limitations are real, and that we have to sort of grapple with the consequences or the implications that flow from that reality. For me, that's not an argument to not engage in what I think is important conduct of increasing awareness of, sensitivity to, and respect for international humanitarian law. I've worked for many years, more than 20 years, with the Australian Defence Force, and will continue to do that in the hope that the ADF maintains a very good track record of compliance with the law on military operations.
Part of just to go back to Syria though, part of the horror is that one side, I was thinking this while you were talking, one side seems to be acting with absolute impunity, while the onus is on the multilateral organisations, the groups, that you've been talking about to maintain morals and standards, and yet that is important, or more important than ever, considering the savagery on the other side. Yeah,
I wouldn't. His first reaction to that proposition is that I don't think it's just one side. I think that the allegations of egregious conduct are levelled against the Syrian government forces, the Russian forces, ISIS, and several other of the non-state armed groups. And some of them are fighting against each other. I would never describe the Syrian situation as the Syrian conflict singular, but I think there are multiple conflicts going on. So I talk about the conflicts in plural because of that view of the situation there. Not that I pretend to be on top of the complexity of it, but I think I know enough to realise it's not a single conflict. But this same proposition comes up regularly in all sorts of armed conflicts involving a non-state armed group on the other side. I mean, you'll often hear, I have conversations with Israeli Defence Force colleagues regularly who talk about us fighting with one hand tied behind our back, while Hamas or Hezbollah don't hesitate to hide their military objectives or their headquarters, their arms caches, their rocket launchers, their anti-aircraft missile batteries inside the civilian population, asking for us to perpetuate or certainly perpetrate extensive collateral damage in the hope that they win the PR campaign. Look at all the people that, the Israelis, the naughty, the bastard Israelis have just killed. But my response to that is to say, well, first of all, what do you expect? I mean, in an asymmetric conflict where one's party has so much greater, overwhelmingly superior firepower, what's the other side to do? You really think they're... I remember once seeing a clip, I think it was the US Marines siege and then house fighting in Fallujah, and a frustrated US Marine saying, if only these bastards had just come out in the open and fight, we'd kill them all. It's exactly the reason why they don't do that.
That's how guerrilla war works.
Of course it is. So first of all, we shouldn't be surprised by it. But secondly, and a much more important question is, why should we attempt to adhere to the standards of the law of armed conflict when our adversaries don't? And that's putting us at a disadvantage. Well, one way I'd answer that is to say, think about the Burnham inquiry that's happening in New Zealand now, and a similar, not exactly the same type of inquiry, but a similar one happening in Australia against, or in relation to allegations of, at best, misconduct, at worst, war crimes perpetrated by our respective special armed forces in Afghanistan. If we are to reduce ourselves to the level of conduct of our adversaries, I believe that I hope our militaries will lose popular support. And they don't want to do that, because in both our respective countries, our militaries have enjoyed popular support, which is largely based upon, we want them to fight hard, but we want them to fight fair on the basis of the rules. So I think that there's more at stake than individual accountability for those soldiers allegedly responsible for atrocities, more at stake than accountability potentially for commanders who are responsible for allowing the culture to fester of impunity, and even more, at stake in terms of popular support in a system of governance where we expect and understand and respect the fact that our militaries are subservient to the democratically elected parliamentarians.
And they're there to uphold the values of that,
of our society.
Society. Look, back to that taboo on chemical weapons.
Sure.
I wanted to ask you about Novichok and those attacks in the UK, because there are bad actors. There are, in spite of that sort of worldwide or global taboo on chemical weapons, we can see that there are people who are trading in these and using these.
Yeah.
Do you think the publicity around what's happened, the tragedies around what's happened, is that going to help or hinder that market or the availability of such things? It
could go either way, I think. It's a really good question, Noelle, and I think my response is it could go either way. The British authorities, in my view, were too quick to blame the Russian government for the attacks on the Skripals first. I don't know if you've noticed, but I think that they've been a little bit more muted about who is responsible for the subsequent one death and one near-death experience in the last week.
Well, that's been a very mysterious...
It has, but the first one also was. The British authorities, I feel like in retrospect that there was a rush to assume, or to get the message out into the PR campaign, that the source of the substance was in the briefcase that Skripal's daughter brought with her from Moscow. So it must have been planted by Russian government agents. Subsequently, it's been discovered that it was on the doorknob of the house where they were staying, and all of a sudden, it's not as easy to attribute that to Russian agents. Doesn't mean that they didn't do it, but it doesn't mean that we should be so quick to assume that they did.
Do you think there are other credible suspects at this point?
Well, I think there could be, possibly. I don't profess to have inside knowledge, but I think there could be a black market in substances like this that organised criminal enterprises can make a lot of money out of, from whatever source is prepared to pay them, from using substances like this to hit particular targets.
And certainly there'd be interests who would have something to gain from stoking up tensions between...
Yeah, I thought the incident
those two countries.
In the KL airport against Kim Jong-un's brother, which was some some chemical agent that required two chemicals to be mixed, and two different women swiped that guy's face at the airport before, and then he had his reaction. So neither of the carriers may have been completely innocent, had no idea what they're actually doing, but neither of the two individuals involved could be infected, because it's only when the substances join together. I mean, I don't know who's responsible for that. I've got no idea. Was that North Korea? Was that, I suspect, not the Malaysian authorities, but was it a government, or was it a non-state armed group, or some international criminal organisation? But
your point is, these are all questions that could also apply to the British incident.
And it's one thing that, again, I mean, we could sort of go back to an earlier conversation. One thing to have determined what the substance was and how much and where it was located and how it was transferred from where it was planted to the individual victims. But attributing criminal responsibility for it is a more challenging thing.
And even more challenging again, how to stop that. You know, is there a role there for particular multilateral players, or?
Yeah, there could be, and I think that in your original question about is this a dangerous thing, or can it be nipped in the bud, I suspect on the dangerous side of the ledger, we'd have to say, as organisations see these events unfolding and realise that if executed cleverly, you can make it look as though you can stir up bilateral tensions, if that's what you would like to do to achieve some other political outcomes. I suspect that there could be quite a few copycat type actions, and that would make it more difficult to get it all under control.
And finally, as we draw our conversation to a close, you know, as the years tick by and the death toll goes up and the horrors continue in Syria, and we seem to be increasing our capacity to tolerate the intolerable, you know, the intolerable news that comes out of there, it becomes the air we breathe. Do you maintain your faith in law to make things better? Yeah,
that's a great question. I think so. And I'm hesitant to say an unambiguous yes, of course I do, because I think that would be an overly simplistic response. I'm committed to continuing to work with the International Criminal Court, even though there are some major limitations to its jurisdictional capabilities, and Syria is a glaring example of that. So I think the position I would take by way of response is say yes, but. And the yes bit is, I believe in the institutions and I want to do whatever I can to strengthen them and increase respect for them. The but bit is, but they are limited in their effectiveness, and I must concede and accept that while I continue to support the institutions that exist, I also need to work for and advocate for increased robustness, strength and efficacy of those same institutions, or maybe future ones that need to replace them to overcome some of the flaws and limitations that are built in.
Professor Tim McCormack, he was here in New Zealand as the Law Foundation's 2018 Distinguished Visiting Fellow. He's Dean of the Law School at the University of Tasmania and Special Advisor on International Humanitarian Law to the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court in The Hague.